What if the person you loved more than anyone was permanently changed by dementia and you became their caregiver? Your relationship would change. You would change too. My name is Aaron, and I'm currently full-time caregiver for Diane, my wife of nearly 30 years. She's living with advanced Lewy body disease. I started the Diane Project to tell stories about our journey. Some stories are about the past. Some are about the here and now. I hope you get something from them. Today, I'll be reading a story that was originally posted to Substack on February 22nd, 2025, titled, This is Kansas Day, Part 1. It's the first of a 3-part essay on my wife's midlife reinvention. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I also put out a newsletter with bonus content. Just visit thedianeproject.com. When we were dating in the early 90s, Diane lost the central vision in her left eye. This can happen with high myopia. At the time, she was a senior editor at an educational publishing firm in Evanston. Vision loss could be both personally and professionally devastating. So, when an eye surgeon proposed scarring the macular tear with lasers, of course she said yes. Those procedures proved to be not only excruciatingly painful, but quite useless. The only positive takeaway from the ordeal was that it seems to have convinced Diane that I was the real deal. She was a 50-year-old divorced mother of 2. I was her 28-year-old boyfriend. This couldn't possibly last. You won't want to be married to an old woman, she predicted. Wrongly, it turns out. Hadn't I driven her to every eye appointment? Hadn't I sat in the room as she endured those laser procedures and then waited on her hand and foot afterwards? In traditional wedding vows, 2 people say they will have and hold each other in sickness and in health. That's a caregiving pledge. I had made good on my end already, and in due time she would return the care. Of course, being a modern couple, we couldn't just do the traditional vows. We also wrote a vision statement. I think we must have copied some of these lines out of a Harville Hendricks book. Here's a sampling. We build each other up, support and affirm each other, and are always there for each other. We live without needing to be in control. We stretch each other's minds and areas of understanding. We laugh a lot. We give each other grace and the benefit of the doubt. We help each other achieve our dreams. To our credit, we took these promises seriously. Every so often we would pull out that 1-page vision statement and review how we were doing. Sometimes we might even flip the page over and read these goals that we tacked on at the end. We have both found a voice, an audience, and a deeply satisfying purpose for our writing. We collaborate on writing projects. I'm sure we put these at the end because, at the time, they were purely aspirational. Diane was revising a book for an educational publisher in Wisconsin. I had a secretarial job and a late-night TV newsletter. I mean, sure, it would be great to compose deeply satisfying works together. But what? How? I don't think we had a clue. Eventually, Diane returned to work with her one wobbly eye. She also took out a sort of insurance plan. She attended classes at night and on weekends to earn a certificate in massage therapy. After we got married, I moved in with her and almost immediately asked to quit my desk job and try my hand at freelance writing. I had that newsletter. It earned no money. I wrote once a month for the Village Voice. I had a couple of contacts in journalism. So this was a very nervy ask on my part. Still, We help each other achieve our dreams, right? She said yes. And 15 months later, the Kansas City Star came calling. They wanted to hire me as their television critic. Paid move, 401k, health insurance, the whole shebang. Now, I'll be the first to admit that writing about television was never deeply satisfying work for me. But I was good at it, and we both felt the propulsive excitement about my burgeoning career as my byline appeared in ever more prestigious publications, including 2 sections of the New York Times. They flew us both to Kansas City, and while I interviewed at the paper, she drove our rental car around town. She looked at the nice neighborhoods that my editor had told us about, and the East Side slums that he hadn't. Afterwards, she gave me permission to upend our world. It was November 1996, and it was the last time I remember her driving a car. As we were preparing to move, Diane lost the central vision in her other eye. She had been assured years before that macular tears very rarely happened in both eyes, and now she couldn't see 5 feet in front of her. One doctor in Chicago proposed a Hail Mary, radical surgery on both eyes to remove the blood vessels that were occluding her central vision. This would require complete immobilization for 2 weeks, so great was the risk of retinal detachment. Diane tentatively agreed to the surgery. She lined up friends to help with meals and such, since I had to get to Kansas City to start work. But she also found a doctor in St. Louis who was a renowned specialist in rare conditions like hers, and sent him her chart for a second opinion. One day, the phone rang at my desk in Kansas City. I picked up and heard someone in a low voice talking rapidly. Realizing it was the doctor in St. Louis, I grabbed a pen and began taking notes. He said, "In my experience, some patients see a short-term benefit from these surgeries, but long-term, their outcomes are no better than patients who do nothing, I'm sorry to say." I called Diane with the news. She sounded relieved. But here she was, legally blind, moving to a strange town, couldn't drive, couldn't look at a screen. She had agreed to leave Evanston after 20 years, leave friends and family behind, all so I could lead the ink-stained life. She was genuinely thrilled for me, but there had to be moments when Diane saw the unfairness of it all. And yet my wife is nothing if not resilient and resourceful. Besides, you don't tell a woman with nutritional healing and your body believes every word you say on her bookshelf that nothing can be done. One day, I think she was in a health food store, Diane found this book on eccentric viewing. This technique, also known as peeking around the blind spot, is based on the idea that if central vision shuts down, the brain can be trained to see more with the periphery of the eye. Up until then, we had both assumed that her vision problem was an eye thing. This book was asserting that it was a brain thing. If you've read Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself, you know that the unlimited plasticity of the adult brain is one of the great scientific findings of the past 50 years. But it wasn't until about 20 years ago that clinicians started doing studies to see if rigorous training could help patients remap their eyesight after vision loss. What I'm describing to you now happened a decade before that. This New Age book on eccentric viewing had a bunch of eye exercises that Diane was supposed to do, and she did them every day for hours until she had to lie down and put a cold compress on her eyes. But in a few weeks, she was able to use her computer again. She put a large text magnifier on her desk, supersized the fonts on her screen, and kept bright reading lights around the house. Her eyesight never was fully restored. The way she always described it was to turn to someone and say, "I can see you, but I can't make out your face." Still, she was able to pass for a sighted person and resume her regular routine. The human brain is amazing. Back when we were getting friendly, not yet dating, we bonded over history. I would go over to her house for dinner, and then we would watch Ken Burns on TV. So when we moved to Kansas City, it seemed natural to learn about the area by visiting its museums. One fine day, we drove out to the Wyandotte County Museum, hidden away in a park at the edge of the metro. We walked through the permanent exhibit, which was mostly archaeology, and then we wandered into the lonely corner that every county museum has, with the community room and a huge stash of donated things. Here is where we found the table with some handmade displays, one of which featured a laser-printed picture of a woman that appeared to be from the 19th century and a paragraph explaining who she was. This was Diane's introduction to the woman who changed her life. Her name was Clarina Irene Howard Nichols, and we learned that she lived in Wyandotte County in the 1850s and 60s. She had been a newspaper editor in Vermont who counted as her friends Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was an early figure in the woman suffrage movement that started at Seneca Falls in 1848 and became a popular speaker on the circuit. Then, in her 40s, she left it all behind and moved her family to Kansas Territory. Clarina Nichols was a woman on a mission. Charming herself into the male-dominated politics of her time, she helped secure for the women of Kansas the most liberal set of reforms anywhere in the Union. She was memorialized in the early volumes of woman suffrage history. And then, like everybody else not named Anthony or Stanton, she was completely forgotten. Judging from this homemade display, Clarina Nichols was even a footnote in Kansas history. Diane was also a woman on a mission experiencing upheaval in midlife, and she wanted to know more about this kindred spirit. She tracked down the museum's director, John Nichols, who was working that day, and began to quiz him. A soft-spoken Kansan, John Nichols, no relation, said he had created the display on Clarina Nichols because, in his opinion, she had been unjustly overlooked. Sensing that Diane had more than a passing interest in this pioneering feminist, John showed us to the archives room and introduced her to Steve Collins. A professor at the nearby community college, Steve was there working on his index of the Quindaro Chindawan, a newspaper that Clarina Nichols wrote for in 1856. Steve told us that there had been a scholar who had gathered Clarina's local writings and published them in the Kansas Historical Quarterly in the 1970s. This man was said to be working on a book about her, but had since passed away. By the end of their hour together, these two men were urging my wife to write the biography of Clarina I.H. Nichols. We started with weekend trips to the state archives in Topeka, working through their slim collection of texts and microforms related to Clarina. Research trips became our favorite form of travel. Besides serving as her driver, I read any texts that she couldn't, and I helped double our productivity at archives, which in those pre-digitization days had to be visited in person. Diane acquired and read through volumes of the Kansas Historical Quarterly, including the 8-part series of Clarina's writings compiled by the late Joseph Gambone, the would-be biographer. Next, we set off in our Honda Civic for a research trip to Northern California, where Clarina spent the last 14 years of her life. When I told my editor at the newspaper what I was doing with my 2 weeks of vacation, she asked if Diane would write a profile of Clarina for the Sunday Arts section. This would be the first summation of her work thus far, and would appear in a newspaper that was read by 1 million people. And this led to a discussion between Diane and me about how she would sign that article. When we married, our pastors had introduced us as Mr. and Mrs. Barnhart, and she began using my last name professionally. But I didn't like the idea of her appearing in the Kansas City Star as Diane Barnhart. I didn't want readers to think I was the reason she was getting published. That was Clarina's doing, and hers. One option would have been to use her first husband's surname professionally. That, in fact, is what Diane's sister had done after her divorce. But my wife had no interest in that option. So that left the name she was born with, Diane Eichhoff. Oh, the places that name would go. If the podcast sounds a little different this time, that's because I recorded parts 1 and 2 of this essay while getting over a cold. I also found a quieter place to record my podcasts. This is a work in progress, as are we all. Don't forget to subscribe where you get your podcasts, and visit me online at thedianeproject.com. Take care.